right, we've got everybody back with us at this time. I believe, Mr. Trapp, the witness is with you.
Yes, Judge, thank you. And welcome back, Mr. Ivory. I hope you had a good lunch. I remember when you were first describing your role and your position at the crime lab, you said that you help identify bodily fluid and DNA. Was that like a way that described what you're doing when you're doing this testing?
Yes, I perform body fluid analysis as well as DNA testing.
Okay. And so when we're talking about these, this identification and the steps that you are taking, first you're identifying what the bodily fluid is, or just that this is a bodily fluid. You understand my question?
So presumptive testing was done in this case for the indications of possible blood. So the Kaplan-Meier test was performed, so it can only indicate that a body fluid may be present.
Okay. But in addition to that, you had made a mention or a description about semen, for example, that it has a different, maybe hard exterior or something like that. Is that something you help identify as well?
So no, I did not examine for the presence of semen in this case. A differential extraction was performed, and the goal of that extraction is to make one sample into two samples. One of those samples, meaning the fraction 2 sample, is where the presumed sperm cells might be.
Okay. So if you were testing an item, you would look for potential blood with the Kaplan-Meier, and then after that, you would then check to see whose DNA it's compared to.
I would generate a DNA profile and do comparisons.
Okay. Now, on November 21st, 2024, I think that's where I kind of stopped speaking with you, and that is where there were the 2 items that were tested from the GMC. Item 16 was the center console. Item 17, 18, and 19 were different positions of a red rock stain. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And then item 20 was the GMC roof liner. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And when checking for bodily fluid, in particular for the GMC center console and the roof liner, there was no presence of blood. Is that correct?
They failed to reveal chemical indications for the presence of blood.
And once you get to that point, that means you're not going to do any further testing. Is that right?
Yes.
All right. But for 17, 18, and 19, those are the red rock stains. Because there was a presence of blood, that's why you did further testing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And in 17, 18, and 19, that would be the red rock stains along the gravel. Side access road is how they described it. Those all, and I was about to say were a match or tested positive, those all had the characteristics, the DNA characteristics from Devin Clark. Is that right?
The profiles from the evidence and the profile from the known standard from Devin Clark were associated.
All right. And those were described as stains in the middle right side of the access road, right?
So 18s and 19, items 18 and 19
Yes.
specifically, yes.
Okay. And then 17 was the left side of the access road.
That is correct.
All right. So now let's make our way to the test on October 25th, 2024. Now, October 25th dealt with the hair and root testing. Is that right?
Yes, it did.
When you received this hair and root testing, you weren't looking for the bodily fluid of blood. Is that right?
That's correct.
You were only looking for DNA.
Yes.
And when you're doing this testing, are you given any idea, other than these descriptions, of what am I looking for? Do you have any preconceived notions, or do you just kind of test and compare?
I look at the descriptions on those items and then test and compare, yes.
When you were talking about the hair, root items that were removed from, let's say, Devin's sexual assault kit, those came back as Devin's DNA profile. Is that right?
The profile from the hairs that were generated in this case were associated with the profile from Devin Clark.
Okay. And does that seem consistent based on what you're testing and how the location where this item had come from?
I can say based on the likelihood ratio result that these profiles are associated.
Okay. And then you also did a similar test with Lyric Woods' sexual assault kit. Isn't that correct?
That is correct.
And you got a similar response or similar result?
For which samples?
Let me be more specific. When we're looking at items 11, oh, she's a 10, sorry. We were looking at the roots that were removed from, these are all actually, strike that. When you were doing your testing on October the 25th, all of those items came from Devin Clark, is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And so when you did all this testing, they all came back to that profile for Devin Clark, except for maybe one bland hair, is that right?
Yes, quite a few hairs were associated with the profile obtained from Devin Clark.
Now, when you, I don't know if you gave a description, but this bland hair that was discovered in your analysis, I'm pretty sure it was October 25th.
Objection, Your Honor.
I'm assuming the grounds were this witness didn't testify to that?
That's correct.
Approach.
Mr. Ivory, in your analysis just of this one day from October 25th, you found that the profile of what you tested was similar to, if not identical to, the person that it came from. Is that correct?
The results support the hyclusionary hypothesis.
Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Now, when you began your testing on June 14th of 2024, there were several items that you tested. This is the larger sample. And there were tests done that had, I guess, a primary contributor, and then there was discussion about a secondary contributor. Did you have to do a further test in order to determine that secondary contributor?
No.
Okay. So that information was developed when you did your normal testing?
Correct.
You didn't have to take an extra step to get there?
No.
Okay. So when we're talking about item 6 from the June 14th, 2024 testing. Now, item 6 was the DNA swab from the interior front passenger door handle. So that would be that door handle that's right there in the front, right next to the driver on the passenger side, right?
Yes.
And you said that there was analysis done and that there were 3 contributors. Is that right?
That's correct.
But in your description of these 3 contributors, it was not made clear that it was one of these standards. Is that fair to say?
So there was an association based on the likelihood ratio result.
And the association was for Mr. Ross?
The association was that the DNA results supported the inclusionary hypothesis, and it was 189 quintillion times more likely if it originated from Issiah Ross, item 14, and 2 unknown, unrelated individuals, H1, than if it originated from 3 unknown, unrelated individuals.
Okay. And so, but it didn't include Mr. Clark and it didn't include Lyric Woods. Is that right?
That is correct.
And were you given any information about who this car belonged to when you were doing your testing?
I understood it to be, I believe, the mother of the defendant in this case.
Okay, okay. And so when you're doing this testing and you know the underwear belongs to a certain person or the pubic hairs come from a certain individual, that would be relevant or important to how you determine your comparisons. Isn't that right?
It's not important. It is just really good to know where the items come from, just so that you can understand how they may be related or not.
And you weren't given any information to further determine who these other contributors were. Is that right?
No, I had no additional standards to make comparisons.
All right. And then in your testing of item 7, that was interior passenger, rear passenger door of the GMC. So that would be the door just behind what we're talking about. Now, in that testing, you said that Lyric Woods was the contributor. Is that correct?
The DNA results support the inclusionary hypothesis.
And then the DNA obtained from Devin Clark and Issiah were excluded from that one. Is that right? For item 7?
Those standards were excluded as contributors to the interpretable components of that mixture, yes.
All right, and so when you say that they're excluded for the interpretable components, does that mean that if you did further testing or if you did anything else, you could get a different result or they would be included?
No, that's not what that means. The mixture as a whole was identified as a number of contributors. That was 3. 2 of those components were interpretable. 1 of them was not. Having additional standards would not change that.
Now, item 8 was again this rear door, but it's the rear driver door. So we're looking at the other side of the car, back behind the driver. Now, that test was inconclusive. And the reason why it was inconclusive is because you couldn't get enough of a sample.
Well, the sample itself was not inconclusive. I could come to a determination about the number of contributors within the mixture, which was 3. Mm-hmm. There were 3 interpretable components. So they all were able to be compared to standards. What happened in this instance is when I performed the likelihood ratio calculations, that no conclusion could be rendered as to the contribution of the profiles from Lyric Wood and Issiah Ross, items 10-1 and 14 respectively, due to an inconclusive likelihood ratio result. So I had performed the statistic, and remember I talked about the levels of support earlier. The numbers were below 1,000. So this is in that area where we would call it unreliable data, so we don't render conclusion at those levels.
So based on what you're describing, there's a possibility that there is a contribution of DNA from either Lyric Woods or Issiah Ross, but you just can't say to a great enough probability.
With the likelihood ratio result, there is no support for exclusionary hypothesis or the inclusionary hypothesis.
But you did not mention Devin Clark. So does that mean that in this comparison, in this analysis, that there wasn't anything that would point to his DNA being on this rear driver side passenger door handle?
So specifically for item 13 on item 8, is that what you're talking about?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So the DNA profile obtained from Devin Clark is excluded as a contributor to the mixture.
Okay. And then I'm kind of working my way around the car, so I get a good picture. So item 9 is the driver's side door handle. And for item 9, it says that this DNA profile is uninterpretable due to its complexity. So does that mean that there's too much information there to siphon out who it is?
So it was just, this was a complicated profile in the sense that there was very little DNA, and I could not establish a number of contributors for that particular profile. And anytime I can't come to a determination about the number of contributors, in addition to certain features that were present in that profile, I came to an uninterpretable conclusion for that item.
And being that your job is to identify these bodily fluids and DNA profiles, you can't render an explanation as to why this was so complex or why there wasn't enough of a sample to render a decision. Is that?
No, I did not. I was not involved in the collection of the items evidence, so I don't know.
Okay. And is that sometimes an issue? Maybe the surface just wasn't swabbed enough, or it didn't get enough on the item for you to test it, or?
That's a possibility.
Now, when you were doing these exams of the sexual assault kit, we'll start with items 10, 2, 3, and 7. That was the vaginal, anal, and breast swab of Lyric Woods. The testing I have here is that it was only female DNA associated. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But then when we got down to item 10.4 and they did the oral swab, that's where we started having these differential testing. And there were 2 contributors that were found in some of these instances.
Yes.
But no additional testing got you to this second one. I think you said fraction 1 and then fraction 2.
Mm-hmm.
How is there a fraction if it was the same test and you got these results using the same analysis?
Remember I said that for the differential extraction, I performed 2 separate extractions. Okay. So the first would be trying to isolate that DNA from those cells that might have been collected from that sample from the person's body. And then the second fraction is where if it's a semen-associated item, there could potentially be sperm cells that are present. That second extraction is really important because the first set of chemicals aren't strong enough to break down any cells, cell walls, or cell membranes from a sperm cell. And so we have to add some harsher chemicals to be able to break that coat down to release the DNA from fraction 2.
And yeah, you had made a mention that you can't say for sure that this sourcing was semen, but you also can't exclude and say it's not. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. So that's talking about the oral swab they did for Miss Woods. Now, 10.5 is the swabbing from her underwear. And that also had this fraction 1 and fraction 2 where Lyric Woods was a contributor and also Devin Clark was a contributor. Is that correct?
So for 10-5, Lyric Woods, the known donor of sample item 10-1, was assumed as being contributor 1 of this profile.
Okay.
And then for the fraction 2 of that same item, which was from the swabbing from the underpants, was that the DNA result supported the inclusionary hypothesis, which was the evidence originating from Lyric Woods and Devin Clark. So the DNA result supported that explanation of the evidence.
Now, similar to item 10.4, could that contribution be due to the presence of semen?
I really can't say because I didn't do any body fluid testing.
So in item 10.4, you said that could be the presence of semen, but that is not possible in item 5, I guess is what I'm asking.
So when you perform a differential extraction, the goal is to isolate these things. Remember, we're doing a manual separation of 1 sample into 2 samples. Mm-hmm. In any of those instances, while I'm performing the separation, there could be a bit of carryover. So you can think of separating the differential extraction sort of like when you have an egg white breakfast versus what you're going to do with your yolk. So you're separating the egg white from the egg yolk. And sometimes you get a little bit of yolk in the white or maybe some white in the yolk. The same can happen with DNA results. And so it can be that the goal is intended where we get the cells from the body versus the cell from from semen or sperm. But there could be some overlap of the 2.
Okay. Thank you. And so I guess your answer to this question is that you can't be sure.
I can't, not without body fluid testing.
And in this instance, when you were testing the underpants or what you were given, the swab from the underpants, you would need, I guess, a further investigation or something further to determine what the bodily fluid was?
Yes.
And that's not your department. Your department is just to test it, not to recover it and or set it aside to make that decision. Is that right?
So in the process of the differential extraction, there is a glass slide that is prepared from the sample so that if in the future serology examination becomes needed, it could be requested. So there is a slide that exists for the fraction 2 items from the kit that could be examined to see if sperm is present or not.
Thank you. Now, item 10.6 also had 2 contributors. Is that right?
That is correct.
And that was both Lyric Woods and Devin Clark?
The DNA results support the inclusionary hypothesis that the evidence originated from Lyric Woods, item 10-1, and Devin Clark. So remember, the DNA results support an explanation of the evidence.
Okay. And this would have been the external genitalia for Ms. Woods, is that right?
Yes, that is correct.
And in this instance, this would also have a separate slide where you could do a test to see if this was related to a specific bodily fluid like semen. Is that correct?
In this particular instance, no slide was generated for this particular item. So this one was not separated into fraction 1 and fraction 2.
Okay. And is there a reason why items are separated into fraction 1 and fraction 2?
Yes, so there is a process for the extractions that I perform where I'm looking at specific information about what we call the male to female ratio. And in the first extraction, a very minute, small sample is taken and an extraction is performed. If you can get information from that sample, you can take that sample forward and produce a DNA profile from it. Now, there are certain instances when what we call the male to female ratio is too great, so I would have to perform a differential extraction, and you can think of this like a needle in a haystack. You know that the male DNA is there, but it's caught up in the haystack of the DNA from the victim or the individual's body that the sample came from. So you can see that, you can detect it's there, but you won't see it in the profile. So in order to see your DNA results better, you can perform a differential extraction.
So in this instance, it wasn't a needle in a haystack. It was apparent that there were 2 contributors.
Correct.
Okay. And is that based on just the amount of DNA that's present?
Yes, it is.
Now, in this item 11.3 was the oral swab for Devin Clark. And that was one of those single source profiles where there weren't any other contributors. It was just Devin Clark's contribution to his DNA. Is that correct?
Yes, Devin Clark, the donor of the known sample, 13, was assumed as being the contributor to this profile.
Okay. But when we go to 11.4, that would be the underpants for Devin Clark. We got something different. We got a multiple contribution again.
Yes, there was a mixture of 2 that I established.
Now, in this one, did you have to fraction it out, or was it apparent as once you tested it that there were 2 contributors?
So this one, the differential extraction was performed, so there was a fraction 1 sample and a fraction 2 sample.
Now, I know when Madam DA was talking to you, there was tests that had these ratios, and they were numbers that aren't traditionally used, like nonillion and sextillion. But one of these had a profile where the amount was only in the millions, and that was this genitalia swab in 11.5 for Devin Clark. Is there a reason why that one was much lower than the other ones?
It would depend on the nature of the profile and the information that was present in the sample. And so based on these results, I'd have to look at the actual graphical illustration of the profile to tell you specifically. Do you mind if I refer to my notes?
Well, I guess I'm thinking more like big picture. You mentioned that 1,000 is kind of like the baseline. If it's above 1,000, then you have reliable data, and then as you get higher and higher, it's more reliable. Is that a fair assessment, or is that not quite as cut and dry?
It's not that cut and dry, but the level of support for the inclusionary hypothesis, as long as it meets that 1,000 threshold, it's really solid data.
Okay. So it really doesn't matter if it's a million or nonillion. as long as we know it's above 1,000, it is
It
reliable.
supports the inclusionary hypothesis if it meets that level, yes.
One moment, Judge. No further questions from the defense, Judge. Thank you.
Redirect.
Just briefly, Your Honor. Mr. Ivory, how easy is it to transfer DNA between one person and another?
That's a complicated question. It's unknown, so different people shed DNA at different rates. So one person could be what we call a high shedder, and they could leave DNA everywhere, and another person may not contribute any DNA whatsoever.
So if I were to rub in Sergeant Goodwin's head here, and then we were to take a swab and test it, those results could be kind of all over the place. Is that what you're saying?
You may or may not be detected on that item, yeah.
But he would likely be detected on that item.
It's possible, yes.
Okay.
Because you take a sample from someone's body, you would expect to find them on their body.
That's all I have, Your Honor. Thank you.
Recross.
No further questions, Judge.
All right. May we excuse this witness?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Judge. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. You're excused from any other subpoena obligation.
Thank you. Well, I think I have some.
Do you need some help?
Yes, let me keep those. Thank you. All right. Sora?
Your Honor, the state does not have any further witnesses. I would ask, given the way that images were previously published to the jury and the small detail on some of those images, if, with the court's permission, I could republish by passing States Exhibits 2 through 32, which were the crime scene photos introduced through Investigator Baldwin, as well as States Exhibits 47 through 55, the photos from the GMC terrain search, also introduced by Investigator Baldwin, and then the messages from the Snapchat return, States Exhibits 130, 132, and 133, introduced by Sergeant Goodwin yesterday.
All right. Snapchat was never published, I don't believe.
No.
What says the defense?
No objection to that, Judge.
Madam Clerk and Bailiff, let's do this. Let's do 2 through 32, starting at juror number 1, and let's do 47 through 55 with juror number 6.
And the Snapchat.
Do that after.
Thank you. There's 2 through 32. And 47 through 55.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remember my instructions earlier when we hand evidence to you. Each of you examine them carefully, thoroughly, take the time that you need. But do that individually without comment to anybody else. When you're done looking at, say, a photo, please hand that to the next juror. Same rules apply.